I think is just marvelous. I was talking with Paul at a dinner, and he told me the fantastic story about how he got the paintings, and they said this has to be shared with people. So I just want to say thank you so much, Paul, for coming today. Lecturer, writer, historian, an all-around great guy.
Yeah.
If you don't know me, I'm Aviva. I'm the director of the library, so if you have any questions or concerns, keep them to yourself. No, you can always come and knock on my door. I'm available all the time, okay? So Paul, I'm hoping that we will get a little tour of the paintings out on the floor eventually.
Absolutely. We will
Field trip.
begin tonight with the background of the bank, and then we'll go out there, if we don't disturb the patrons, and we'll decode what they say.
So excited. I'm so excited. And if I could just say that I think that a nice fundraising opportunity would be to do like postcards of the Franklin Bank paintings, maybe in the future, some high res.
Okay.
Maybe we'll see about that. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Aviva. I appreciate it. It's so good to be here in the library. This library is home to me since I was about 3 or 4 years old, and I was privileged to be a trustee here for 18 years when we built the addition to the building. So it's home, and now so many of my friends are trustees of the library now, which is great. So, and a lot of, I think we have at least 3 here, right? 1, 2, 3. Any others? Yeah, we got hey, that's a quorum. All right. So this evening, to really understand the murals, I think that we have to go into the background of the Franklin Square National Bank and its impact on American history. We're not talking about some cutesy little small town bank here. We're talking about a bank that was once the 18th largest bank in the United States and a major international player by the time it ended. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why the Franklin Square National Bank is important, how the murals got painted, what the murals mean, and how we got them, because that is a story, and why they're here in the library too. So we'll go through all of this as quickly as we can. But let's get started. If you want me to slow down, just say so. So the Franklin Square National Bank, also known as the Franklin National Bank, that's how you probably remember it. Because in around 1950, they changed it from the Franklin Square National Bank to the Franklin National Bank, and it became just one of the largest banks in the metropolitan area. It was one of the most innovative banks in the history of American banking. Important in the development of Long Island during suburbanization, it essentially financed the suburbanization of Long Island through dealing in FHA mortgages. Played a huge role in building houses in Franklin Square from 1934 onward until through the 1960s. So it played a major financing role. It was gifted with an extraordinary leader whose name was Arthur Roth. He has been called one of the 3 most important people in the history of American banking. Now that's no small thing to say, because Arthur Roth, he took banking and made it into what we call today consumer banking. Banking that reached out to the small homeowner, the small businessman, the small person, and made banking essentially popular. Not everyone set foot in a bank in the early 1900s. Well, when Arthur got done with them, they practically lived there. And you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So the Franklin Square National Bank made incredible amounts of money, and it reshaped the banking industry forever. You will see how, and we're still experiencing the changes that Arthur Roth initiated. If you had bought 10 shares of Franklin Square National Bank in 1926, by 1962, you would be the equivalent today of a millionaire in buying power. I really mean that. It was known as the fastest growing, most profitable bank almost in the United States for a while. So here's Arthur Roth. I was really very privileged to know him. He sat me down, told me his story, let me go through his personal papers, and he was very, very kind. He was a member of the Historical Society, and when he came to visit the museum in 1993, he gave me a $5 bill, not as a tip, but in 1934, the Franklin Square National Bank printed its own money. And national banks were allowed to do that. I mean, it looked like a regular $5 bill, but it said the Franklin Square National Bank on it. And instead of the Secretary of the Treasury, it was signed by Arthur Roth. And I love to tell the story. Bill he hears me tell the story. Arthur would get the sheets of money directly from the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. You know, the uncut sheets with about 20 bills to a large sheet. And then the tellers would have to cut them ever so carefully with a paper cutter, you know? But Arthur would always have, rolled up in his pocket here, an uncut sheet. He also had one hanging in his den. He really was into this sort of thing. He'd go to a nightclub, or he'd go to a fancy restaurant in the area, and they'd bring him the check, and he'd click his fingers and say, "Waiter, a scissor, please." And with great drama, he would take the uncut sheet out of his pocket, and in front of the whole restaurant, he'd clip off enough $5 bills to pay the check, you know. So he was a card. He was a great man in so many ways. He was very generous, very community-minded. He lived into his 90s, you know, and he left a great mark on American banking. I'm biased because I was friendly with him. So in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, that age of bootleggers and the flappers and all that, and the Charleston, the little town of Franklin Square had about 1,000 people or so. It was a one-horse town, to say the least. The people of Franklin Square, the businessmen, decided to start a bank. What were they thinking? Okay? It was a mom-and-pop operation. Fred Schilling, who owned a hardware store, became the vice president of the bank. Now, he didn't have qualifications to become a banker. He didn't even have qualifications to sell hardware. No, seriously, he was sick of going into New York and commuting every day. And he said, "Martina, I can't take it anymore." You know, the commute was really bad in those days, on the trolley, no less. And his wife said, "Fred, why don't we open up a business? Then you can stay home." And he said, "Well, what kind of business does Franklin Square need?" And she said, "Well, we don't have a hardware store. Open up one of them." He said, "Okay." And that's how the Schillings got into hardware. They had no qualifications, and they had no qualifications to do banking. They got a gentleman from Hempstead that knew a little bit about banking. I think his name was Arthur Phillips or something like that. And they made him bank president because he was legitimate, you know what I'm saying? And they ran the bank just like a little store. If your checking account was 5 cents under, they'd call your house and say, "Get down here, put a dime more in your checking account so the checks wouldn't bounce." They made no money in the 20s. The bank really wasn't going anywhere. And they were in a storefront. They started in a storefront right, you know where Schillings used to be, about 3 doors down towards New Hyde Park Road. The safe is still in the basement. It used to be a card store. Okay? Now, here's Schillings, right here. Schillings, this is the Leibach building. That's where Leo Leibach he built those stores and apartments. And Leo Leibach became a director of the bank. Wendell and Rauch became a director of the bank. Well, what interest did they have in a bank? They were builders and they needed financing. So they thought if they sat on the board of directors, they'd have a nice chunk of money coming in when they needed it. So this is Schillings right here. The bank was right over here, okay? This is a potato field at the corner of James Street and Hempstead Turnpike. So James Street would be right about here. And that is the site of the future building of the Franklin Square National Bank, the big white bank that dominates our downtown area today, that's now, since 2015, on the National Register of Historic Places. So this is really an extraordinary picture. The Hoffman family gave that to us long, long ago. It just shows you how rural downtown Franklin Square was, circa 1926 or 27. That is the whole staff of the bank when it opened up in 1926. Directors, president, tellers, secretaries, everybody. That was the whole bank community, basically. There was one teller, and the teller was called the cashier. Sounded like a good title, but the cashier meant you did everything. You had to do everything in the bank, okay? So that's how we got started. So in 1929, the Franklin Square National Bank built its own headquarters. Now, it still stands. It's the building I just was talking about, occupying that potato field. So they start to build this new bank building, but you know something about 1929, even if you're not really into history, because it's the crash, right? October of 1929 was the crash. And immediately when the stock market crashed, it sent ripple effects throughout the economy, and banks started closing in the United States, left and right. The Franklin Square National Bank should have closed. It had very little capital, it had almost no extra money, and in 1929, 1930 and 31 and 32, people were not depositing money in the bank. They were withdrawing money because they needed it to live on. So the bank's assets were shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. Now, meanwhile, they had gotten in over their head. They built a new bank building, okay? And they didn't need all the room, and they didn't have any customers, really. This bank really should have folded up. That's all I can say about it. That's the building they built in 1929 and 1930. This is James Street right here. This is Hempstead Turnpike here. And this core of this building, this is still standing. This is still standing, but you don't recognize it because it was added on to over here, and there's 2 stories above it now. And the door, which was on the corner, has been moved to the middle of the building. But that's the original 1929 structure is still there. It's painted white, so it looks very, very different today. But you can see it. So the new bank opened just as things were going down the drain. And people were asking, well, can you have a bank without money? You know, they were running out of money very fast. And when Arthur Roth came to the Franklin Square National Bank in 1934, he said, I was alone in the bank rattling around in an overly large building. So in 1934, that building was much too big for the Franklin Square National Bank. I think they could have operated out of a cubbyhole in Nicolese's barbershop, okay? So the bank nearly collapsed during the bank holiday of 1933. It should have closed up, but the directors said, we don't want to give up the bank. We have hope in the future of Franklin Square. So they mortgaged their own houses and put it up as collateral to keep the bank open. It was an insane decision on their part, but it made them millionaires in the long run. Who knew what would happen down the road? Now, how did Arthur Roth come to the bank? It was Roth who had those murals done. How did he come to Franklin Square? Well, he worked for Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company in the Bronx. He was a city boy, okay? He came from an immigrant family, and he was there in the Bronx, and he had married a lovely young lady by the name of Genevieve, okay? She was a wonderful person. And Genevieve was expecting their first child, all right? And she wasn't feeling terribly well in the Bronx. And she said, Arthur, maybe if we moved out into the country, I would feel better. It might be a nice thing to move out to the country. And Arthur said, well, Genevieve, you know, we're in the middle of a depression. Where am I going to find a job just like that? So they were out on Long Island. They were driving in like their Model T Ford down the Turnpike or Hillside Avenue or something like that. And they're coming in one direction. And Fred Schilling, who is the vice president of the bank, is going down the other lane of traffic. And Schilling's wife, Martina, she was a Roth originally. She said, oh, you know, Fred, stop the car, beep the horn. It's my cousin Arthur and his wife. Pull over. And they motioned to one another, and they had a little family reunion. They were happy to see each other. And Fred Schilling knew that Arthur was a banker, and they needed a cashier in Franklin Square. And Fred said, I was going to give you a call, Arthur. Would you be interested in being the cashier of the Franklin Square National Bank? And Arthur said, well, and of course Genevieve looked at him and said, this might work out. We can move to Long Island. And you know he took the job. And they bought a house in Rockville Center. Arthur Roth reported for work in 1934 during the depths of the Depression when things were really bad. And he went through the bank's books, came home that night to Genevieve and said, my dear, I've made a big mistake. This bank is about to collapse. The Federal Reserve has sent it letter after letter warning of consequences if something wasn't done to steady the bank's finances. I don't know what we're going to do. I'm going to lose my job. This is going to cave in. And Genevieve said, well, we're having a baby, Arthur. You can't lose your job. So Arthur decided he had to make this work. The first thing he did is he went door to door in Franklin Square and asked everybody to open up a checking account. And if they didn't know how to do it, he showed them. And he went from literally from house to house like a salesman, getting people to come to the bank. And he said, I have to come up with some other things that I can do to make money. So he had a motivation to make this job work, okay? That is the $5 bill that Arthur Roth gave us. I guess this is a series 1929, the Franklin Square National Bank, signed by Arthur Roth right there. They're very, very rare. They're worth a few $1,000s now. There's not many of them around in mint condition. So if you come to the museum, we'll show it to you. It's under lock and key, but it's visible. All right? So survival. So the directors pledged that they would do. So the fateful meeting was with Schilling. That's Arthur when he was a young man. He was when he first came to the Franklin Square National Bank from the Bronx. Okay. So he was appalled, and he goes door to door. Now, the thing that really makes the bank money, what FHA mortgages. This was something new during the Depression. The FHA mortgage, the federal government was providing mortgage money to get the market loosened up a little bit. Bankers were very, very skeptical about an FHA mortgage. They said, well, we don't quite know what this product is that the federal government is doing. So Roth said, I think it sounds good. Let the Franklin Square National Bank become a mortgage broker, and we will set up the mortgages for people who want to buy the houses as the country came out of the Depression. He wound up servicing most of the mortgages from FHA in Nassau County. He was very aggressive in getting into it. Now, Franklin kept a lot of those mortgages, and they made good money on those mortgages. But a lot of them, after they serviced the mortgages and set up everything, they sold them to other banks, and they got a fee every time they did this. This allowed Franklin Square not only to survive, but to grow rapidly. They became the mortgage experts in this area, okay? Now, Arthur said the consumer has to be first. He said we can't be a snobby banking institution where people don't want to come in here. We got to bring the people in like we're having a sale in a dollar store. That's really what, he had that approach. It was brilliant, okay? And so he said the consumer is first. he had the first parking lot owned by any bank in the United States. That was an innovation. No bank owned a parking lot. He bought the land from Willie Hoffman, made it into a parking lot. Do you know the Federal Banking Board was so skeptical, they thought he was doing some shenanigans. He had to go down to Washington, D.C. and testify what he was doing. But he did, and they opened up their parking lot. So Roth made things pay as Long Island's economy improved in the late 1930s. So here are some houses right off of Franklin Avenue. There was about 1939. They're being sold. People are coming to look at houses again. The economy is getting better. Roth was behind the financing of all of those things. Do you know, to stimulate building in Franklin Square, he even bought vacant land and resold it at cost to builders, not making a profit, just because he wanted more customers. So he figured if we build more houses in town, they'll open up accounts and it'll make things go. He was truly, he had a brilliant mind when it came to that sort of thing. He also essentially invented the bank walk-up window. First walk-up window anywhere in the United States was a Roth innovation. I'll even show you a picture of it in just a moment. He said, I want our bank to become a friendly bank, where people will want to go because they like us, and draw them in. Oh, he did all kinds of things. He gave lollipops to the kids. He, at Christmas time, he had a Christmas pageant for the little kids, because he knew when the kids came in, their mothers would come with them. And in those days, in Franklin Square, the mothers generally did a lot of the marketing and the finances during the day, because the bank was only open from 9 to 3. So Arthur said, I have to win over the female consumer. He understood that very, very well. And I'll show you how he did that with the walk-up window. He made Benjamin Franklin the mascot, even though Benjamin Franklin is not really the namesake of Franklin Square for sure, but he seized on it because, a penny saved is a penny earned. And he loved Benjamin Franklin. For Franklin's 250th birthday, Arthur had a masquerade ball, and he dressed up as Benjamin Franklin. They all dressed up as the founding fathers. He really got into the role. I even have his Benjamin Franklin glasses that he wore to the masquerade party and gave them to us. So it's interesting. Now, during the war, World War II, Arthur Roth formed something called the Purchase Club. Now, during the war, maybe you don't know this, but you couldn't buy a car new, you couldn't buy a refrigerator, you couldn't buy a stove, you couldn't really buy much of anything, not even a new house. So Arthur said, people are really working hard during the war, but they have no place to spend their money. I'm going to have them join my Purchase Club. And he said, okay, deposit so many dollars in your account in my bank every week, and when the war is over, you can buy a new car, or you can buy a refrigerator, or a new house. It was immensely successful, and money flowed into the bank in the early 40s like you wouldn't believe. And rapidly, Franklin was becoming an important regional bank. Now that is the first walk-up window anywhere. And you see how it says outdoor banking? Really what it was a gazebo, a little gazebo on the side yard of the bank on James Street. And we have a color picture of this somewhere, but this is the black and white. So Arthur said, I noticed that a lot of mothers were very, very afraid to come into the bank with their children, because the bank was this hush-hush place where it was very formal, and people were walking around like with ties and suits on and all that sort of thing. And he said, I thought that these mothers especially would be intimidated from coming into the bank. And many thought they weren't properly dressed. I don't want to shock you, but some were wearing slacks. Okay?
Oh, no.
So Arthur said, so I did an outdoor bank here. And he said, that way, the mothers with their strollers and their little ones, right here, would not feel embarrassed about coming into a formal bank building if they were just doing errands and doing the marketing. They'd be much more comfortable. It proved to be a great success, and this gazebo became a symbol of the bank in the 1940s. So, anyway. Now, this is an example of the bank at Christmas time, circa 1940. In 1939, the bank had been more than doubled in size. From that little corner piece that was over here, where the door was here, they moved the door down to the middle, and they more than doubled the bank's area because they simply didn't have enough room for all the offices and functions that they were doing. So in only a few years, the bank, was more than doubled in size. What Arthur did is he had a Christmas pageant for the kids, with singing, with music. The children would sit on the floor. He had a puppet show in there, and holiday displays were a feature of the Franklin National Bank all the way up, as long as Arthur was there, until 1968 when he left the bank. He had this touch with people, and you can see the local community really responded. They lined up for one show after another, and it was free. All right. So step by step, the bank expanded, and this is where the murals come in, okay? Now, that's the original bank. That's the expanded bank in 1939. So you can see how it's getting bigger and bigger. But I want to show you the modern bank that Arthur planned. He had just the first floor in 1939. The second floor, the third floor, this area, and the tower was added in 1946 when the war ended. And even that was inadequate for all the people who wanted to do their banking in the Franklin Square National Bank. So what Arthur did also is he bought other banks and opened up branches all over Long Island. So that by the 1960s, probably by 1968, there were over like 110 branches all over Long Island. And the bank even went into Manhattan. That was I'll tell you about that terrible story in a few minutes, but this is the bank we see today, okay? Now, Arthur, when he planned this new bank, see, this is kind of a traditional bank. That was the traditional bank. The mortgage department was up there. His office was in the back where his portrait was. But this is the area that really interested Arthur. That was called the consumer lobby, the consumer lobby. Now, when I was a little boy, I used to go in the bank, I could never really figure out this bank. Because even as a 6-year-old, I understood it was really two banks. I would say, why are there two banks? And they would, they were attached to one another. You could walk from one to the other. This was the kind of the traditional bank with the marble teller's cages, and that's where all the businessmen went. That's where the local merchants would bring their, evening till, and where they get their change and everything. So if you were a business person, you would go into this side of the bank. This side of the bank was for consumers. It was called a consumer lobby. And they had kiosks all around where you could do whatever you needed to do. You could apply for a small loan to buy a vacuum cleaner. You could, if you were going on a trip, you could get, $100 worth of Canadian dollars. You could bring your savings account there. They had a little low thing for children. And the children they had their own kind of bank books. When the children went in, they'd get a lollipop with every transaction. That was the first time they were really doing that. So this was the consumer lobby. And when this was built, they brought an airplane into the lobby and hung it from the ceiling. This was, a 30-foot high ceiling at least. And Arthur said, see, not only can you get a car loan, you can get an airplane loan. And some people actually did that. They thought that was going to be the future, that we'd be commuting in airplanes and all that sort of thing. But in the consumer lobby, that's where the murals were. That's where they were. Because they were there to inspire the average person. And I'll talk about the theme of the murals, but I just want you to know that's now the Franklin Square Pharmacy. There's a pharmacy there, okay? This is now, I guess, a Chase Bank or something like that. And over here, there's the Franklin Square Pharmacy, okay? Now there is a close-up of one of the murals. I may as well mention a little bit about them to prepare you for when we go outside and look at the real thing. These murals were painted in 1946-47 by an artist from Hempstead by the name of Edward Sinnott, and they are signed, okay? They were done in oils. This is part of a style in the 1930s and 40s. Murals were very, very big, you know? And if you go around to post offices on Long Island, like the Garden City Post Office, and if you go to Rockefeller Center, you see murals on the walls. Those are early 1930s buildings. And the WPA project funded a lot of artists to make murals. So this kind of art, this kind of very complicated, a lot going on in a big canvas, that was very, very popular in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. I would say this mural came pretty much at the end of that style. Once you get into the 1950s, shortly after this was painted, you really don't see a lot of murals being painted in this kind of realistic style. So I won't call it old-fashioned when it was done, but you know, it kind of was going out of style. Now, the whole series of 5 murals is called The Future Is Now. The Future Is Now. And what Arthur wanted to say to people when he gave the commission to Mr. Sinnott is that you have to save now for your future if you want your dreams to come true. So he said financial planning is everything. I mean, that could be a commercial today. But you have to really plan if you want your dreams to come true. So there's almost like a dreamlike kind of a setting there. This was deliberate. And at the bottom of one of the panels, there is like an hourglass with wings. The future is now. Like, you better get yourself going if you want to afford that house 5 years down the road. Now, to give you an example, each of the panels has a certain theme. And this theme is called professions. And it really illustrates the economic life of Long Island. The economic life of Long Island. And of course, by analogy, Franklin Square, because these could be Franklin Square scenes. So, of course, in the middle, who more appropriate than the Long Island farmer, right? With all of his produce, his carrots, his cauliflowers, cabbages, and everything. And of course, that was the produce of Franklin Square. There were still lots of farms here until the early 1950s, and they were what we would call truck farms or market gardens. They were not so much potatoes by then, but crops like seasonal vegetables that could be easily sold in New York, which is very close by. You get a lot of money for that. And that's kind of what we were growing. We were growing a lot of spinach. We were growing a lot of carrots, radishes. Everything was very, very seasonal. Beets. So beginning with the radishes early in the season and ending with the cauliflower when it got cold, there was a constant flow of vegetables. And we have all of this documented, you know, in our historical society. Here's the pharmacist with his big jar of colored water. Young people don't know what that is. That's, you know, it used to be these vials of colored water would be in pharmacies in the 1940s and 50s. I like this figure right here. That's like Rosie the Riveter. That's a female factory worker, which is straight out of World War II, because we're only a year or two out from the war here. And of course you have a barber. There's the barber pole. There's a barber cutting a little boy's hair. There's the filling station right there. That's the Lilco electric power plant. It looks like the one in Glen Head because that's powering the economy. And of course you have a man on a telephone pole here, telephone operators right here. This is a butcher with the meat in the window right there selling to a customer. So you've got all of these professions, whether they be retail. Now, my eyes don't show me, but Arthur Roth painted himself in at his desk giving someone a loan as the banker. But he didn't give himself a very big spot. It's very, very small. And maybe when we go outside, I can point it out to you. It's really, really small. So these are the professions. And each of the panels, as you'll see when we go out there, can be it tells a story. It can be decoded. My favorite scene is the Franklin Square home of the year 2000, as conceived in 1947. Wait until you see that. That's really quite something, because he does show the future as well as the present. This is when they were putting the airplane into the consumer lobby. They had to take the plate glass window off the front of the building to get it in. And then they pushed it in and they suspended it from the ceiling of the consumer lobby. And here's Arthur right there watching the whole scene. By then, he was shortly going to become president of the bank. Yeah, he had started off as a cashier, but he became the bank president by the early 1950s and eventually chairman of the board, well deserved. There's the children's savings desk, which is kind of nice. This lady here is giving all of these lollipops to the kids, and the kids have their pennies there. So really, when you went into the Franklin Square National Bank, it was, I have to tell you, it was the center of our business district, the center of our economy. And as one of our former trustees and treasurer, Marilyn Muller, used to say, everyone worked at the bank. She worked at the bank. And she said everyone in town worked at the bank. It was the biggest employer in Franklin Square, So Arthur also developed a credit card, and this is a really very interesting story. If we all know what a credit card is. So the credit card that Arthur developed was not really a card. It was a booklet. It was a little booklet, like one of those pocket calendars. And on every page of the pocket calendar was a list of businesses by village, actually. And if you had your name on this list of businesses, you had to bring ID, you brought your booklet with you, you bought something in a store, and you gave in your credit booklet. And they charged you, they had your address and your name, and at the end of the month, the bank sent you the bill with a little service charge. So you could walk in and buy something without cash. Now, in 1953, that was very shocking. That you could actually go in someplace and not use money, And it was an innovative thing, but it never made a lot of money. However, in the basement of the bank building, the window where you could go and pay your credit account is still there. They never took it out of the basement. That room is still there. I've seen it, and it really didn't make money. But in the 1950s, that was buying power and convenience. The first bank credit card anywhere, I think, in the country. And we have a copy of it in the Franklin Square Museum, which I hope you'll visit if you haven't been there yet. It's very rare. It was paper. You got a new one every year. Everybody threw them out. But the former manager of the bank in the 1980s, I guess Marie was the manager there, she had been one of Arthur's employees. And she said, you want one of the old credit cards? I said, oh yes. And she gave it to us. I think it probably should be in the Smithsonian collection. I mean, that's how really important it is. It's not leaving Franklin Square, however, that's staying with us. All right. So that's it. That's the credit booklet. And it was a little booklet, looks just like that. It's about this big. And yeah, we have it. We have it, again, under lock and key, but you can see it. That's the inside. So if you're in Levittown, you could get appliance repairs. In Lindenhurst, you could go to the Ace Paint and Wallpaper on Wellwood Avenue, and, you know, here's Lynbrook, you know, all these stores accepted Franklin National Bank credit card or credit booklet. It's really kind of innovative, you know? So if you found a business in there, and you know, these businesses like this because you were more apt to go into the business if you knew you could charge something. And people who normally wouldn't have gone in there would buy. So it helped everyone. So it was a hot stock by the 1950s, one of the largest and fastest growing banks in the United States. But Arthur was very worried. He saw the New York City banks coming out here to the suburbs, and he said, they're horning in on our territory. We want to fight back. Let's go and meet them on their turf. And so Arthur made the entry into the New York City banking market, which you know is very cutthroat and very, very competitive. He was now up against Chase Manhattan. He was up against Bankers Trust. He was up against all of those big city banks. But he went about it methodically, and within a couple of years, there were about 6 or 7 branches of the Franklin Square or Franklin National Bank in Manhattan. And here was his brilliance with banking. So he said, what we're going to do is have a different kind of a bank. On Broadway, there was a vacant lot, and he built a bank that was round on a vacant lot, landscaped the area around it, and called it Bank in a Park. And in grimy New York City, it was an oasis, and people went to the Bank in a Park. In our museum, we have the original architect's rendering of the Bank in a Park. It's really, you know, I think we could do a history of American banking with all of Arthur's things. The other thing that he did that was, some of you may have heard of, was something called La Banque Continentale. He had gone to Europe, all right, and was impressed in France that they had private banks. They were like private clubs, okay? And Arthur said, we're going to do the same thing here in New York. So right by the Plaza Hotel, he opened up a bank. It wasn't called the Franklin Bank. It was called La Banque Continentale, the Continental Bank. And he said, if you want to open up an account, minimum deposit, $100,000. Now in 1960, that was a lot of money. He said, but if you open up an account with us, no worries. We have day and night safe deposit. So when you go to the opera, if you want to put your diamond necklace right back in the safe deposit, the butler will be there to open the door and take care of you. Not only did he do that, he said, we can get you theater tickets if you need them. It was like a concierge, you know, that took care of the needs of the wealthy. He had a ladies' tea room where the customers would come, they'd sit in very, very like Louis XVI chairs, and they would be served tea. Well, you put $100,000 in the bank in 1960. That was like equivalent to probably like $1 million today. Do you know people were fighting to get an account in La Banque Continentale? I mean, that was a real brilliant move that he made. So this is, you get the impression, this is a man with creativity, and of course that's how the murals fit into all of this. It was one of his ideas to make the bank unique, you know? Now, going into New York City proved to be Arthur's undoing. Because to get into the New York City banking market, he made some mergers with some of the other smaller New York City banks. One was the Federation Bank, you know? And part of the deal with the merger was some of the directors of Federation would become directors of Franklin. Turned out that the Federation directors didn't like Arthur, and they didn't think he was doing a good job, that he was taking too many risks, that he was maybe a little too creative. And they teamed up with some disgruntled people within the bank, some of whom were trusted associates of Arthur's. And they ganged up and betrayed him and forced him out in 1968. And it was terrible. It was a really terrible time. he was almost ready to retire anyway. I think he was going to retire in 2 or 3 years, and they just put him out. So how was the house that Roth built without Roth? And let me tell you, it was no good. Foreign investors got involved in the bank. Among them, an Italian investor with the Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, Michel Sindona, and they played fast and loose with the bank. And they gambled on foreign exchange, changing from lira to dollars, and would go up and down. The bank losses were astronomical. And by October of 1974, the Franklin National Bank was insolvent, and it collapsed. It was the largest bank collapse in the history of the United States up until that time. You're talking about the 20th largest bank in the United States at that time. It was huge. Now, they wouldn't let the bank just, totally collapse. So the following week, it opened as European American Bank and Trust Company. That's how it reopened, or EAB. Maybe some of you remember that. Yeah, you'll remember that. Yes, you got a mortgage. Well, that's how it reopened. EAB bought the assets of Franklin, and so people didn't lose their account money, and the federal government backed up any losses that were there. So EAB became the owner of the bank, and EAB was the bank that gave us the murals. Okay, so EAB, of course, was very different. By the way, a bank stock certificate from Franklin National. Now it's worthless. Bill and Gladys Hesselbach were members of our historical society, and Bill Hesselbach was an officer under Arthur Roth. We had a lot of Arthur Roth's colleagues in our society years ago. So that's when it closed. This is an office in New York City, and it said we're now the European American Bank and Trust Company. So when EAB took over Franklin, Franklin Square was no longer the headquarters of the bank. They had moved it to Mineola. Then they built the EAB Center at Mitchell Field over on Hempstead Turnpike. They didn't need this giant bank building anymore because all of the staff had largely been moved out. So, EAB said, we got to make some money from this building. And they decided to rent part of the building to a business, which became a pharmacy here in Franklin Square. Now, while all of this was going on, I knew the bank manager, Marie Grosso. She was in the Chamber of Commerce. We worked on projects together. And I kept saying to Marie, if they ever redo the bank, the murals, I think the Historical Society would really like them. And Marie, being a very loyal Franklin Square person, she went to the top executives of EAB when she heard that her bank was going to be cut in half and half was going to become a pharmacy. And the bank called us and said, would you like those murals? I said, yes. Where do I sign on the dotted line? So we got a deed for the murals. We actually always get a title deed when you make an acquisition. That's very, very important. So the bank officer, I think his name was Leland Lowe, he signed off, and we got the deed. So I got a call, and they said, you got to come and get the murals tomorrow. So I said, well, I got to find out, how I'm going to get them home. So I went down to the bank that afternoon. Now, remember, I'm thinking about these murals from when I was about, 8 years old and that kind of thing. And I remember they had a strip of chrome around them, almost like a little frame. So I assumed I brought my ladder with me. I'd get up on the ladder, and I would take them off the wall like it was a picture hanging there. Well, to my astonishment, number one, they were much higher than I had remembered. And my little ladder didn't even reach them. They're like here at the library, they're up high. And the second thing I found out is they were not on hooks. They were like wallpaper that had been glued to the cement wall. Wow. I said, how the heck are we going to get these down? even off the wall. I said, this is a huge job. So I went home and spoke to my wife. I said, oh, I don't know how we're going to do these. I have to get them off the wall by tomorrow. I thought I'd go in tomorrow before work and get them. No. So my wife in her wisdom said, call my Uncle Bob. He was a member of the Historical Society, but he lived in Uniondale, okay? Call my Uncle Bob, and he knows what to do in all of these situations. He was one of the most handy people that I have ever known. He was a New York City policeman, but he had every tool that exists in his garage, that kind of thing. So I called him up. I said, Uncle Bob, I need your advice. How do we get these things off the wall? I said, they're so high. So he said, no problem. You need scaffolding. I said, well, where am I going to get scaffolding from tomorrow morning? He said, I have it in my garage, no problem. I'll put it in my station wagon, and when the bank opens at 9 o'clock, we'll set it up, and we'll get the murals off the wall. So I said, okay. I said to myself, but I have school tomorrow, I have to teach. Well, needless to say, it was the only day I ever called in sick when I really wasn't sick. But this was for the cause, you know what I'm saying? So 9 o'clock in the morning, we get down there. We set up these scaffolds like we were painters. You know, we were all the way up above the banking floor, pretty high. And so we found out it had been, 50 years almost since they were put in. This was in the 90s. And we went up to them just like this when they were on the wall. And we pulled at the corners, and they just kind of peeled off very nicely off the walls. I'm sure art restorers would gasp in horror how we did it. But we peeled them right off the walls, and they weren't damaged really. And we rolled them up, kind of like scrolls, like a roll of wallpaper. And then we had to take the scaffolding down, we had to move it to the second one. And Marie came in and said, gentlemen, you have to be finished by 1:45. She said, because the new tenants are coming into this space at 1 o'clock, and you can't be here. I said, all right. 12:30 we got done. We rolled up the last scroll. We put the scaffolding in the trunk of Uncle Bob's station wagon, and we went home, Well, I wasn't there. But I was told at 1 o'clock when the new tenant came in, there was a scene. The new tenant had rented the space thinking the murals were going to be his. Yes. Now, this is no penny ante game because the murals were appraised for well over $50,000 in those days. I mean, these are bona fide works of art, And he got his lawyer after the bank. The bank said we gave a deed to the Historical Society. He called me a lot. He was very threatening. And he said, I'm going to send a lawyer over to your house. I said, send a lawyer. There's nothing you can do. You'll never find the murals. They're in 5 different houses all over Franklin Square. You don't know where. So, this made the papers, and the papers made a big deal of this, that this was a controversy in town. But we really had a leg to stand on because we had everything legally donated before all of this happened. So finally, he said, well, we're going to go to court. We're going to take the Historical Society to court. We're going to take the bank to court. He really wanted those murals, and I understood that. I went down and spoke to him. And I never went in the pharmacy again because I just didn't want to face the man, But, so the bank finally said, take us to court. We have a lawyer on retainer, and this will drag on for years, and it will bankrupt you. And then the pharmacy backed off, and, we got to keep the murals. Then we had, the next step, we had to restore them because they had not been cleaned since they were put up. And some of them had little cracks in them. So we got a grant for over $50,000 from Senator Kemp Hannon, who we're honoring at our annual dinner this year because he did this for us. And he was very public spirited. He got the money for us. and we went to the firm of Millicent Danks that operated out of Amagansett, out by Montauk. And we brought them out there, and she took 2 years to finish the job. Any little piece of paint, she restored, she put them in, cleaned them, and she took the wallpaper and she stretched them on wooden frames. So now you can take them off the wall like they were a regular framed picture. And they're much more stable now than they ever were because they're kind of protected. She put a protective coating on there, so they're really, really good. But then, of course, the murals, they just wouldn't leave our lives. Millicent said, I have another job coming in. You've got to come out and get them. Well, remember, these are not little scrolls now you could put in your back seat. These are gigantic things. So there was nothing to do. Nobody in the society wanted to go out, so I had to rent a truck. I've never driven a truck in my life, before or since. But I figured if I didn't drive on the LIE during rush hour to Amagansett, I'd be okay. So I set out in my truck, and I had to get this back into Washington Street School by 3 o'clock. I set out at 9 o'clock, and I got back to Franklin Square 2:45, and we put them in the museum when it was in Washington Street School. From there, they came to the library, because we had just finished the new expanded library, and I think they speak for themselves where they are now. So the murals, they belong to the Historical Society. That will never change, but they are on, extended loan to the Franklin Square Library. We have an agreement, and we think that this is the place where the public can see them on an everyday basis and really enjoy them. They're meant to be enjoyed. So Aviva, you've got the perfect spot for them, and we thank you that you take such good care of them.
We are so happy to house them. You can see them through the glass at night. They are just, they define the library. And also the partnership between the two organizations, which is so close, it binds us together.
Yeah, well, thank you again. So that's a little bit of material, maybe I gave you too much, on how the murals originated, how we got them, and all the twists and turns it took to get the job done. But we figured it out, and so maybe we could go out and have a look now. Yes. And you see the hourglass there with the wings on it. That's the whole theme. That really shows you the future. We start up here with the bank. You see the bank building, like right up there? The bank is the center of this because it's really helping the future come about. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you see a house being built. The result of savings. A house being built represents the future, what's coming. And this was painted just as houses were being built again after World War II. So this is very timely. What I really love is right above now, that's the Franklin Square house of the future. It's round, it looks like a spaceship. And that's what they conceived the house of the future would look like. Streamlined, modern, lots of glass, and all of that kind of thing. And of course they have things like youth, old age, marriage. There's St. George's Church in Hempstead, if you look right up there. They were very big on the local landmarks. And you see some more professions there. You see a school teacher. All of these things have to do with the future. And if you look right here, kind of diagonally left up from the hourglass, you see a family looking in wonder at a whole new suburb of streamlined homes with rows of trees and everything. So really, this is almost like a vision of the future. That's kind of how they conceived it. And it all takes place on Long Island, because if you look at the bottom margins of the murals, it's that jagged coastline of the South Shore with the water and the land. So these are very, very Long Island pieces. So over here again, we see more professions. It's all about economic life. This is in a bank after all. So you have a firefighter, and you have a milkman, and a baby, and father and son with trains. And if you look all the way up in the middle of the second panel at the top, there's the Nassau County Courthouse in Mineola. So they're interspersing very local scenery. All the way up at the top, that could be the Montauk Lighthouse on the right side, top right corner. So you see all of that. Then when we move over to this panel right here, this, again, it's interspersed with a lot of education. So if you go to the top left, Hofstra Hall at Hofstra University. Then it was Hofstra College. The big tower just below that, that's Sewanaka High School. And that was the Franklin Square High School until 1956. We sent our students up to Sewanaka in Floral Park. We had to share a high school with the other communities. And we have some of the Sewanaka cheerleaders who were known as the Rockettes, actually. Yeah, they're the cheerleaders. We have an original Rockette uniform in our collection somewhere. And a football player. And a graduate there with the graduation cap on there just below Sewanaka. And of course, these students are reading over there. So they're very, they're looking again towards the future. And then of course you have on the left side, technology. On the lower right, lower right, technology. I guess that would be Grumman, aviation, where they're building planes and they have all of that complicated technology for planes and radar and all of that. But it's interspersed with things like recreation. So you have hunting, middle at the bottom. You have golfing above that. And then you have Jones Beach Water Tower, upper right. You just have to look carefully, and you will recognize so many of these places. Edward Sinnott chose things that you, the consumer, would readily recognize from your life. He wanted to make this very accessible to you, and he actually did. Lastly, over here, this is the last one, and it continues. So you see things like at the very, very top, middle, you see a commuter getting ready to go on the Long Island Railroad, waving goodbye to his family. That's very 1950s, isn't it? The commuter and all of that kind of thing. And you see on the lower left-hand corner, you see the consumer who, look at, they have their hands full of packages, right? Because at the end of World War II, you have to remember, the Depression was over, we had won the war, and there was the promise that we were going to build this society which would have a lot of material plenty. There would be a lot of consumer goods to be had. And by 1946, people were salivating. They wanted to start buying again. They had saved all this money, and now they were ready to, they were ready to buy and everything. In the very middle, which I rather like, it's kind of a glass, rounded building. Almost looks like something out of the 1939 World's Fair. It's the Franklin Square bus terminal of the future, with this, kind of a streamlined bus, and across, next to, right to the left of the man in the hat holding the packages, you see hardware. Now that's the Shillings of the future, because after all, they're at the bank, and Shillings was across the street. And of course, at the top left, you see the Long Island Railroad and an outline of Nassau County, and a clock and the Statue of Liberty, which goes into, our close relationship with New York City, where most of the jobs were in the 1940s, really, if you wanted to get a good job with a corporation. So all of these things, the more you look at them, the more things you will recognize. And they really are great works of art that, even though the Historical Society owns them and the library, has them here and takes care of them for us, they're really the common property of all of the people of our village and our area, and it's for them to enjoy and appreciate for generations to come. So we will keep close watch on them and make sure that they're doing well. We will have someone look at them periodically. If you want to look on the other side of the library, there's some great watercolors.
Paul, there is one more, the one you
Yeah.
had in your
We
PowerPoint
have
over
a-
here.
Oh, yes, that's the one we saw on the PowerPoint, the professions, yes, yes. These, I just want to say a word about these watercolors. These were done by Sal Indiviglia, who was a military artist during the Korean War. He was a local resident. These were his private collection. And he showed them to me at one point. He said, I want you to see these, but he wasn't ready to give them up. But he was in, you know, I guess when he reached about the age of 90, he donated them to the Historical Society. And again, it wouldn't make sense to have them closed up somewhere. They're so wonderful. But they are local scenes. They are scenes of our community. Starting from the left, you see a creek, right? And that is located roundabout a little south of where Garden World is today on Franklin Avenue. It's the Mosquito Control Commission cleaning out the creek to keep the water flowing. The water tower is still the Franklin Square Water Tower on Arlington Avenue. That's still there. That's probably about where Stop and Shop is on Franklin Avenue. The other one is an old farm shed just to the right of that on Franklin Avenue. It was in ruins. It was going to be torn down, and Sal went down and did a watercolor of it. Just to the right of that, you have a carnival. We used to have, of course, many carnivals would pop up in the summer, and this is just one such that was on a vacant area. To the right of that, you see these strange-looking black figures. Well, if you grew up in Franklin Square, you kind of know what that is. Those are fig trees that have been wrapped up for the winter in tar paper. Because when those cold winters we used to have, if you had a fig tree, it would really kill off the fig tree. And in those days, most people would wrap up their fig trees. I don't bother to wrap up my fig trees anymore because in this weather, it doesn't hurt them, you know. But that was a fixture you would always see, and people would put a bucket on the top of it, usually. That is down near First Avenue in what we call Gardenia Park, which was very much an Italian-American neighborhood. And the Italian people, they brought little shoots of fig from the old country. I don't know how they got it through customs, but all the fig trees in Franklin Square, they come from these shoots that were grafted off the old ones in Italy. And then, of course, the one to the right of that is indeed a street in Gardenia Park. Sal lived just south. That's looking north, probably on 2nd or 3rd Street off of 3rd Avenue in Gardenia Park. If you look at the houses, they're cottages, really, or bungalows. Gardenia Park started off as a summer community in the 1920s, and it was, you know, it was just summer homes, really. Most of them now have been replaced by McMansions, as you know. And the last one on the right is a farm stand on Franklin Avenue, also somewhere near where Stop and Shop is now. There were a lot of farms in Franklin Square up until the mid-1950s. Our last farm was built on in 1982 or so. It was a flower farm.
I think we have one more around by the fire exit over here.
Oh, do we?
Yeah, two more.
Okay.
When were these painted?